face up to the reality that we're really living through more than one plague at this particular point in time. And of the several plagues that we are now suffering through in these United States, perhaps the most insidious plague is the longing for the good old days. In particular, versions of the good old days that never actually existed. This idea that the past was somehow much better than the present. Rabbi Stephen Kushner of Bloomfield, New Jersey, beautifully addresses the Israelites' struggle with this plague of dangerous nostalgia while they're in the wilderness in the book of Numbers, in particular in this week's Parsha, Korach. He writes that a romanticized longing for the good old days is a common theme for that wilderness generation. Recently freed from an oppressive existence, but one nonetheless characterized by certainty, the Israelites are hard-pressed to adjust to the uncertainty of freedom. From the very moment of their redemption at the sea, they yearn for the clarity and familiarity of the past, and though the past was a past of slavery. Whether it was a lack of water or food or wanting a more varied diet, they complain, they grumble, and in time they'll even rebel, right here in this week's Torah portion. And throughout it all, their mantra is this constant rewriting of history that says, boy, life was better in Egypt. He quotes Rabbi Moshe Waldox, who taught that this verse was the beginning of Jewish humor. A paraphrase of Exodus 14, if I may, where the Israelites say, what? They didn't have enough graves in Egypt? You had to bring us to the wilderness to die? And along the way, as with so many manipulative complainers, it then turned kind of melodramatic. If only we had died by the hand of the Eternal in the land of Egypt, in Exodus 16. And then in the next chapter it becomes, why did you bring us from Egypt to kill us here in the wilderness? And then over time, and particularly as we enter the book of Bamidbar, the essence of the kvetching turns from yearning for a return into something well beyond romanticizing of the past. Rabbi Kushner says the nostalgia crosses into the surreal and the absurd and even the shameful. Suddenly, Egypt is remembered for its good food, the fish, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlics, we're told in the book of Numbers. And the worst of all comes in this week's reading when Korach's men pose this heretical question when they say, is it not enough that you brought us from a land of milk and honey? Totally flipping the story on its head. What a perversion of memory that became. And so it is with all revisionist historians, many of whom we're dealing with today. I mean, what else could be meant by make America great again? Because when exactly was that golden period for all Americans when everything was so much more wonderful than it is today? For many decades after the Civil War, the leaders of what was essentially that illegal rebellion against the United States, those leaders were transformed by many into heroes of a romanticized and fictionalized culture to be remembered and honored and longed for, conveniently leaving out the fact that what they were fighting and longing for was slavery, to retain slavery. There are those remembering the Civil War is the war of northern aggression, and sometimes in certain circles referred to as the recent unpleasantness. And many of us were taught the myth that the North was and remained a haven of freedom and equality for black people. In a section of the Torah text that often gets overshadowed by the story in here of rebellion and subsequent punishment of Korach, God commands that their fire pans, those of those who rebel, these small sacred shovels that were used for moving incense and ash around the sacred fire on the altar. The text says, take the fire pans of those who sinned and make them into hammered sheets of plating for the altar, and let them serve forever as a warning to the people. Rabbi Kushner points out that this is more than just a symbolic gesture. The altar, for all intents and purposes, is the sacred center of life between God and the people of Israel. There's no avoiding this place. It's encountered several times a day, and it's covered with a graphic reminder that remains of those who rebelled, to whomever should wish to approach God. And we as a nation are working to wake ourselves up from collective nostalgia and misremembering and those things we were not taught correctly, seeing some positive actions of clearing away distorted and hateful images that perpetuate hate and perpetuate lies. Voluntarily now, more and more cities, museums, corporations, and even animated characters and various shows are being removed, transformed into more honest and genuine depictions. Aunt Jemima, who first appeared as a brand character in 1889 as the enslaved yet happy Mammy archetype, was finally removed from the pancake mix and the syrup bottles 10 days ago. Increasingly, and with broader and broader support, many hundreds of statues of Confederate leaders and symbols of the Confederacy, mostly erected decades after the war itself, during the decades of Jim Crow laws, they're being taken down, sometimes in the midst of angry protest, and sometimes by decision of lawmakers and leaders. And there is, of course, a long way to go in that effort. Large numbers of white Americans have recently come to understand and embrace the original and redemptive and clear meaning of Black Lives Matter. In his words, Rabbi Kushner concludes, "No one likes to be reminded about the failures and pains of the past. Our psyches go to great lengths to cover up and to sublimate that which we would rather forget. We instinctively want and often need to restructure the past in ways that will allow us to move forward. But there are some things that need remembering. There are some moments in history and some moments in our own lives that we must remember as they were, without sugarcoating." Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, in his book Zachor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory, writes that memory is the most fragile and capricious of our faculties. Indeed. And well we know that there are some things we would rather forget, but if there's one thing we Jews have learned and embraced as mitzvah, it is the holiness of remembering. This is an essential part of the lesson of the story of Korach and his followers. There's a reason we read it every year, like that plating put on the altar made from the fire pans. It comes as constant and regular reminder that some things must be remembered exactly for what they were. May we continue the work of the sacred and hard journey. Amen.